Chapter 2. Conquest in Controversy, 1884 through 1917. Oscar Micheaux was born January 2, 1884, outside of Metropolis, Illinois, some 40 miles north of Cairo, near the Ohio River. According to Roberta Palmer, a descendant of Metropolis's founder, the city was built on the site of Fort Massac, where the French, British, and Americans held it at various times. George Rogers Clark came through on his surveying expedition, and Aaron Burr stopped here on one of his journeys, plotting. We're a sleepy little town on the banks of the Ohio and have not made a great deal of progress in our many years. We are the only town in the USA with the name Metropolis. The warm tongue-in-cheek analysis by Roberta Palmer seems to contrast with what Madeline Stahls, then a graduate student in education, referred to as an exceptionally fertile, nurturing, interesting environment, and in some ways politically progressive. In modern times, Metropolis integrated its public schools on its own initiative prior to the enactment of the 1954 Brown decision rendered by the U.S. Supreme Court. However, more than a century ago, it was a terminal on the Underground Railroad, a springboard to freedom for African Americans fleeing slavery. Micheaux was the fourth son and fifth child of a 13-member family headed by Swan Sr. and Belle Willingham Micheaux. Both Swan Sr. and Belle had been enslaved in Kentucky and had migrated to Illinois after the Civil War. Their new home allowed them to fare well considering the times. Micheaux recalled his mother was a school teacher and his father owning 80 acres of farmland and being considered well-to-do for a black man. Two of Swan Micheaux Sr.'s sons went off to fight in the Spanish-American War. One, whose name is unknown, returned home without ever seeing combat. The other, Lawrence, who was the eldest, died in Cuba, 1898, from typhoid pneumonia. The brother who returned moved to a nearby town and became a waiter, much to the disappointment of Belle Micheaux. Mrs. Micheaux had frequently voiced strong opposition to her children ever working in positions of servitude. There was also William O., known as W.O., an older brother with whom Oscar was not close, and a younger brother, Swan, named after his father. Micheaux's sisters were Ida, Maud, Ollie, Ethel, Gertrude, and Beatrice. As a prospective industrious farmer-to-be, young Oscar was rated poorly by his family and neighbors. He was a good student but remembered being criticized for talking too much and being too inquisitive. Micheaux also remembered recognizing his very early talents as a conversationalist and salesman. This soon became apparent to his family, too, when he returned from the market with much better sales for the farm goods than any of his brothers. He grew to dislike many of the local African Americans, and he perceived hypocrisy among the clergy. Micheaux wrote that a substantial number of African Americans had settled in the area as farmers or as emancipated arrivals after the Civil War. The land they owned was difficult to till, and within one generation, most of their children moved to the big cities, preferring city life to struggling on a farm. As the older generation died, they were replaced by German immigrants who continued working the land until it was finally prospered. The Micheaux family moved briefly to Metropolis proper to ensure a better education for their children. Oscar was not impressed and complained of inadequate teachers and facilities. His peers regarded him as dull, and he described many of them as wretchedly poor, ignorant, and envious. Church was the center of activity, a place where people dressed up to go on Sunday to sing and shout praises to the Lord. Belle Micheaux often did the latter, much to the embarrassment of her children. During the week, however, Oscar viewed many of the churchgoers to be far from Christian in their words and deeds. Particularly offensive to him were the preachers, most of whom he regarded as spongers who traveled house to house dressed in finery in order to be fed. As early as 15 years of age, he was highly critical of church leaders and of neighbors who constantly complained about slavery and the white racism since emancipation. In his young view, this was merely an excuse for lack of ambition. Micheaux's vocal opposition did not endear him to the townspeople. Listening to a different drummer probably made for a lonely, if not unhappy life. Thus, in 1901, at 17, Oscar Micheaux left Metropolis, hoping never to return. Perhaps it did not occur to him at the time that the environment which he thought he hated had allowed him to become a very independent and outspoken thinker. His writing suggests that traditional values were passed on to him by a close-knit family, with the exception of having no respect for the clergy. There is no indication that he was anti-religious, however, and he frequently admonished others for not leading moral lives. By early 1902, Micheaux had worked feverishly as a laborer, survived malaria, and saved enough to get to Chicago by way of several small Illinois towns where he held odd jobs. He went to work as a bootblack after receiving a chilly welcome from Brother W.O. in the Windy City. W.O. and other African Americans in Chicago represented a larger version of the same attitudes Micheaux disliked in Metropolis. By fall of the same year, he went to work for the Pullman Car Company, which provided luxury sleeping cars for the nation's railroads. As a porter, he received an education in the world. He was able to travel to many cities across the country and see how people lived. Micheaux was struck by the great variety of opportunities that existed in America, and he refused to be limited by his race. During train stopover, he had a chance to visit theaters, observe different businesses and lifestyles, and voraciously read tales of how people had become successful. He became smitten with the American dream. However, in the larger cities, Micheaux continued to be disenchanted with the pretentiousness of urban African Americans. He also was repelled by what he saw as their fast life, their vices, and the squalor in which many lived. He seemed to ignore the fact that many were forced to live that way. With his earnings at the Pullman Car Company, a major employer of African American men during the heyday of the railroads, Micheaux was able to start his first bank account and began saving in earnest. It was also through this employment that he was able to talk to white farmers, ranchers, and other passengers about the advantages of owning land. Intrigued, he decided to try his hand at becoming rich through real estate. The Great Northwest was virgin territory then. Micheaux decided to gamble his savings in 1904, buying land in Gregory County, north of Dallas, South Dakota. Micheaux's arrival on the frontier was met with curiosity by white farmers. They seemed amused by the talkative black man and reasonably certain that he would fail in his farming efforts. Micheaux was equally certain that he would not fail. He worked like a Trojan to ensure his success. In time, he was both popular and respected. Every so often, he would go out on a Pullman car to make more money in order to buy more land. During these excursions, especially in Chicago, Micheaux urged other African Americans to follow his example by moving out to the Northwest. The dazzle of the big city was too much for most of his listeners to leave. Nonetheless, Micheaux continued to urge African Americans to migrate, and he became fairly well known among them in the process. The opportunity to travel outside the U.S. came after the 1904 presidential election. Micheaux went to South America as a valet for some white millionaires. Once again, he found himself in a unique position to learn how whites took their share of the American dream. Micheaux's observations of life in early South Dakota reveal no sense of racial injustice or oppression. It's difficult to imagine his life being free from such antagonism, given the times, but he left no diary of it. He did observe limited intermarriage among the pioneers, and he commented unfavorably on those few local mulattoes who sought to deny the black blood in their veins. His greatest complaint was loneliness. Loneliness would later lay the framework for much of his writing and his film making. Micheaux apparently fell in love with the daughter of a Scottish neighbor around 1909. In his recollections, loyalty to his race precluded such a union. There was also the fact that South Dakota had recently passed a strict anti-miscegenation law that would have sent him to jail. Though Micheaux made no mention of it in his first novel, The Conquest, he was undoubtedly aware of the country's racial climate. There had been a bloody race riot in Springfield, Illinois, slightly over 800 miles from central South Dakota the previous year. 8 African Americans were killed, and the property of countless others was either stolen or burned. A national outcry led to the birth of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, in 1909, but racial tensions in the country remained deep. Micheaux's parents moved to Kansas to live among other prosperous African-American farmers, but he decided to go to Chicago in search of an African-American wife to bring to South Dakota. Micheaux married the timid daughter of a strong-willed clergyman sometime between 1911 and 1912. Friction seemed inevitable, given Micheaux's stated dislike of members of his father-in-law's occupation and the fact that both men had enormous egos. There was also philosophical differences between them, which reflected a division among African-American educators and intellectuals. From 1895 until the death of Booker T. Washington in 1915, two schools of thought separated African-American leadership. The split was known as the Washington-Du Bois controversy. This controversy was a debate of socio-economics, not racial identity. Washington proposed a policy which he felt would protect the South's economic base so that it could compete with Northern industrialism in an atmosphere of minimal social agitation between the races. He made this proposal in a speech before the Cotton States Exposition in Atlanta in September 1895. At the center of his ideas was the view that the races should be separate but equal, and he stressed industrial economic advancement for African Americans, particularly since the pocketed masses lived and owned land in the South. Whites, at most social levels in the North and South, praised Washington for this speech. He was lauded by editors of leading newspapers, prominent whites, and even Grover Cleveland, then President of the United States. The content of Washington's speech offered whites above and below the Mason-Dixon line a common ground from which to approach the Negro problem. It was an easy way out for an uneasy white America, a plea for patience among African Americans by a powerful leader. However popular Washington's speech was with whites, it met with strong disapproval from most African American educators. Since Washington was one of the most respected African American leaders in America, intellectuals who did not share his thinking turned to W.E.B. Du Bois, an equally brilliant and eloquent African American professor and writer, for a more militant form of leadership. Du Bois asserted that the priority of America should be equality among the races at all levels. Economic solutions should be addressed secondarily. He argued for suffrage and all citizenship rights guaranteed under the U.S. Constitution. Further, he and his followers urged increased agitation to get those rights. Micheaux considered himself to be one of Washington's greatest admirers, even dedicating his first novel to the leader. He frequently lectured other African Americans on the virtues of Washington's thoughts, as he interpreted them, while admonishing them for their shortcomings. Micheaux continued to feel that many African Americans were more interested in complaining about whites instead of working hard and taking advantage of the opportunities in America. He discussed this debate among African American leaders in his first novel, The Conquest, in a chapter entitled The Progressives and the Reactionaries. Micheaux either misunderstood or misanalyzed the platforms of both Washington and Du Bois. He was incorrect in noting that Du Bois had refused to oppose Washington and that the anti-Washington movement had never gained momentum. While purporting to be imbued with the spirit of Booker T. Washington, Micheaux urged African Americans to leave the South and the ghettos of the North in order to settle in the Northwest, whereas Washington urged them to remain in the South. Micheaux also wrote in that chapter that his wife's family was more closely aligned to Du Bois' beliefs, and that they had often taunted Micheaux about his Booker T. Washington ideas. The Washington-Du Bois controversy was probably more of a conflict among African American intellectuals than the masses. In 1905, barely 40 years after the end of slavery, many African Americans were still stigmatized by the results of previous rules that made them unable to read or write. Most of what they knew of the debate was rumor, hearsay, and confusion. To some degree, Micheaux, a man of limited formal education, is an example of this, with his incorrect analysis. Nonetheless, it appears to have been a frequent topic and subject of disagreement in the Micheaux household when his in-laws came to visit. Within a year after the marriage, a series of hostile letters passed between his father-in-law in Chicago and Micheaux in South Dakota. The long-distance arguments were generally about the daughter, but most were petty and arrogant tests of the strong wills of both men. It left Micheaux's wife torn between an almost childlike obedience to her father and loyalty to her husband. In frail health and pregnant, she gave birth to a stillborn son while her husband was 60 miles away working on what now amounted to 800 acres of farmland. This was in February of either 1912 or 1913. The unfortunate event gave Mrs. Micheaux's father and sister reason to come to South Dakota. Over Micheaux's strong objections, they took the sickly woman back to Chicago. His subsequent efforts to get her to return had failed as of the writing of his first novel, The Conquest, the story of a Negro pioneer. The impact of his failed marriage seemed to haunt Micheaux throughout his writing and film careers. He left behind many accusations, but today we have only his side of the story. Bergman noted the year 1913 as the beginning of a decade in which some African American authors chose to ignore the existence of racial tensions. Two such authors he listed were Oscar Micheaux and Henry Downing, whose play The Tangle would one day be adapted for film by Micheaux. The basic message of these writers was that hard work and dedication would lead to the American dream. Their heroes were dusky versions of white fiction heroes. Micheaux's first novel, The Conquest, was published in 1913 by Lincoln Press and is autobiographical. With the exception of name changes, most of the historical events, town celebrations, bidding for railroad routes, prairie fires, land purchases, etc., related in The Conquest are historically correct. Many of the facts were verified by Dr. Henry Sampson, including photos, by checking names and dates of land purchases, and books on South Dakota. Micheaux wrote of African American life in Illinois and South Dakota using thinly veiled name changes in some instances for people and places. For example, the hero is Oscar Devereaux. Gregory, South Dakota is Megory, and Dallas is Callias. Micheaux often left out dates, burdening the reader with the task of playing mathematician in order to determine the year of a particular episode or event. Written in a labored, often pretentious style, the book tells of a young black man who goes to the frontier and becomes a prosperous rancher. Though in love with a Scottish woman, his racial pride forces him to end the relationship. Out of loneliness, he marries a woman named Orlean McCraleen, daughter of a Chicago black clergyman. The preacher's constant interference eventually destroys the marriage. In reality, it was the loneliness of the prairie that convinced Micheaux to actively look for a bride. He had been previously corresponding with a teacher in southern Illinois named Orlean McCracken. Orlean was a beautiful young lady and the youngest of two daughters of Reverend N.J. McCracken, who had been pastor of the Black Methodist Church in Metropolis, Illinois, when Micheaux was a young boy, and later became a presiding elder over the southern Illinois district. The two were married on April 20th, 1910. As in The Conquest and in Micheaux's life, the constant interference of Orlean's father eventually destroyed the marriage. James Law called The Conquest the first African-American novel in America to feature a leading black character in the role of pioneer. In style, it is preachy to African-Americans about their shortcomings. Micheaux urged self-improvement by going to the Northwest and homesteading. Though he considered himself a follower of Booker T. Washington, he advocated settling there instead of the South. The Forged Note, a romance of the darker races, was published with illustrations in 1915 by Micheaux's own company, Western Book Supply. Again, there's a suggestion of autobiography with the lead character, Sidney Wyeth, an African-American writer traveling through the South selling his book, The Tempest. The Conquest? This was how Micheaux sold his own novels. He was unable to drive, so once a book was finished, He would hire a chauffeur to take him throughout the black sections of the country. On tour, he would promote his work and himself among the African American bourgeoisie and the masses. He used these occasions to continue urging African Americans to improve their lot. The forged note tells of Wyeth's lectures and his observations of attitudes and life in the South. This pattern occasionally led Micheaux into confrontations in real life, but it served him well by establishing a large following for him and his work throughout the black grapevine. By the time he wrote The Homesteader, 1917, again using his publishing house, Western Book Supply, Micheaux had become fairly well known among not only African Americans, but also white farmers and businessmen in Nebraska, Iowa, Oklahoma, and South Dakota. He traveled by horse and on foot to peddle his wares to the whites. Micheaux presented an imposing figure. He was a charismatic 6-footer in an age when people were generally shorter in stature and more reserved in demeanor. One of his actors recalled him as impressive and charming enough to talk the shirt off your back. He wore long Russian coats and wide-brimmed hats, which surely must have been an attention-getter to his audiences and customers of both races. His writing seemed to have appeal as well, according to the 1966 recollection of Merritt Hull of Crane, Montana. My father homesteading and farmed until 1903. Then they moved to eastern Montana. In 1915 or 1916, they received a book, The Conquest, written by a Negro who farmed in that country at the time. My folks knew him and liked him, so I suppose he sent them this book, but where it went, I don't know. My mother read the book out loud. My parents commented on it at times as they read it. Micheaux's book was probably sent from South Dakota, since no records exist showing him as a landowner in Montana. The Homesteader appears to be an expansion and fictionalization of the romantic attachments Micheaux described in The Conquest. There is even similarity in the names of the characters. Jean Baptiste is an African-American farmer in South Dakota who rejects the love of Agnes Stewart, a white neighbor, because of their racial differences. He marries instead Orlean McCarthy, daughter of a Chicago black minister. The couple return to South Dakota, where interference from the father-in-law is unbearable. He persuades his daughter to sell property which Baptiste had given her. The bride goes insane, killing her father, then herself. Baptiste, arrested for double murder, is absolved in the crime through the investigation of a detective hired by Agnes Stewart. Stewart is later found to have black blood, making a marriage to Baptiste possible. The novel's jacket claims that the story is at least partially true. It states that Micheaux's land was sold at far below market value by his wife, who forged his signature. The forged note. The novel jacket also says that Micheaux pursued legal redress through the land courts of Washington, D.C., until Secretary of the Interior Franklin Knight Lane decided against him. A search through U.S. Department of Interior records from 1909 through 1915 offers no support for such an allegation. Nonetheless, The Homesteader became a popular book among African Americans and some white farmers of the Midwest and Northwest. Continually building his promotional skills, Micheaux used the Chicago Defender to advertise his book. This newspaper was based in Chicago but sold throughout the country wherever there were large African American populations. It carried stories written by African American writers in key cities about news of regional and national interest to black audiences. It was particularly popular among many in the South for its outspoken stand against racism and lynching.